I never thought I'd see the day when excavators would roll onto my property, engines roaring, as they positioned themselves around the small wooden bridge I had lovingly built with my own two hands. The bridge that connected my backyard to the walking trail I'd created through my own wooded lot. The bridge that apparently offended Linda Pearson, the self-appointed queen of Pinewood Estates, so much that she was willing to break the law to tear it down. But there she stood, arms crossed over her designer cardigan, her perfectly highlighted hair not moving an inch in the spring breeze as she directed the workers where to position their equipment. A smug smile played on her lips as she noticed me walking up my own driveway, clearly thinking she had finally won. What she didn't know was that I held the one thing that would bring her whole HOA empire crashing down around her. My property deed and survey showing that not only was my bridge entirely on my land, but that my property had never legally been part of Pinewood Estates in the first place. It had started like any other Saturday morning in Cedar Creek, the kind where the sun filters through Georgia pines, casting dappled shadows across freshly mowed lawns. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of weekend life, lawnmowers humming, children playing, and the distant splash of someone enjoying their pool. I was enjoying my morning coffee on my back deck, admiring the small wooden footbridge I had completed just 2 weeks ago. The bridge itself wasn't anything fancy, but it was sturdy and well built, arching gracefully over the narrow creek that ran through the back of my property. I'd spent 3 weekends constructing it, carefully measuring each board, routing the edges of the handrails until they were smooth to the touch. It connected my main yard to the wooded acre behind it, land that had been in my family for generations, long before Pinewood Estates had sprung up around it. I was midway through my second cup when I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against my concrete driveway. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Linda Pearson's distinctive walk announced her presence like a warning bell. As president of the Pinewood Estates HOA, she had made it her personal mission to inspect, criticize, and regulate every square inch of the neighborhood. The fact that I had never signed up for her HOA seemed completely irrelevant to her. "Mr. Wilson?" she called out, her voice carrying that false sweetness that never quite masked the steel underneath. "We need to discuss that structure you've built." I took my time standing up, setting my coffee mug down carefully before turning. To face her, Linda stood at the edge of my deck, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Behind her, Tom Richards, the HOA vice president, hovered awkwardly, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Good morning, Linda," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What can I help you with?" She gestured dramatically toward my bridge. "That unauthorized construction needs to come down immediately. You failed to submit plans to the architectural committee, and it violates at least 3 of our community guidelines." I'd had this conversation with Linda before, about my mailbox, about my garden shed, about the native plant garden I'd put in to attract butterflies. Each time, I had patiently explained that my property wasn't part of Pinewood Estates. Each time, she had simply ignored me. "Linda," I said, crossing my arms, "as I've told you many times, my property isn't part of your HOA. My family owned this land long before your development was built. I never signed any HOA agreement, and I never will." She gave me the same dismissive smile she always did when I brought this up. "Mr. Wilson, all properties in this area are part of Pinewood Estates. Your continued refusal to acknowledge this doesn't change the facts." "I have the deed and property survey that says otherwise," I replied, keeping my tone level. "The bridge is on my land. It doesn't affect any easements. It's well built and safe. There's nothing more to discuss." Linda's smile tightened. "We'll see about that. You have 72 hours to remove it, or the HOA will take action." She thrust a piece of paper toward me, an official-looking notice with the Pinewood Estates letterhead emblazoned across the top. I didn't take it. "Linda, I'm not removing my bridge, and you have no authority to make me do so." She dropped the notice on my deck table. 72 hours, Mr. Wilson. I suggest you comply." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, Tom trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. I picked up the notice and read it, my anger growing with each ridiculous claim. According to the document, my bridge was an unauthorized structure that fails to meet community aesthetic standards, potentially impacts shared waterway access, and was constructed without proper approval. It demanded removal by Tuesday morning or further action would be taken. I crumpled the paper and tossed it into my recycling bin. This wasn't the first time Linda had tried to force her rules on me, but something about her tone today felt different, more determined, more threatening. I had a feeling this battle was about to escalate. I wasn't wrong. Monday evening, as I pulled into my driveway after work, I found a small group of people standing at the edge of my property, pointing toward my bridge and talking in hushed tones. I recognized them all: Linda, Tom, and Diane Cooper, the HOA treasurer. They scattered as soon as they saw my truck, but the message was clear: they were planning something. That night, I dug out all my property documents, the original deed from when my grandfather had purchased the 5 acres in 1962, the survey that was completed when the developers built Pinewood Estates in the early 2000s, and all the paperwork, confirming that while I had sold the front portion of the land to the developers, the back acre and a half remained separate from the development, including the creek and the land beyond it. Tuesday morning, I called in late to work. If Linda was planning something, I wanted to be home to deal with it. Sure enough, at just past 9 a.m., I heard the rumble of heavy machinery coming down the street. I stepped outside to find a small convoy turning onto my street. Linda's luxury SUV leading the way, followed by a pickup truck pulling a trailer with a mini excavator and another truck carrying several workers in matching uniforms. The convoy stopped in front of my house, and Linda emerged from her vehicle like a general surveying a battlefield. She spotted me standing on my front porch and walked over, her face a mask of determination. "Your time is up, Mr. Wilson," she announced. "Since you've refused to comply, the HOA is exercising its right to remove the unauthorized structure." I stood my ground. "You have no right to touch anything on my property, Linda. My land isn't part of your HOA and you know it." She waved, a document in my face. "This says otherwise. We have authorization to remove structures that violate our covenants." I glanced at the paper. It looked official, with a county letterhead, but something felt off. "Let me see that," I said, reaching for it. She pulled it back. "You had your chance to handle this reasonably. Now please step aside and allow our contractors to do their job." "If you set 1 foot on my property without permission, that's trespassing," I said, my voice steady but firm. "If you touch my bridge, that's destruction of private property." Linda's smile was cold. "Actually, since the creek is a shared waterway that affects all Pinewood Estates residents, we have every right to maintain it. Your bridge is obstructing that maintenance." This was a new argument, and a ridiculous one. The creek ran through my property before entering Pinewood Estates proper. "My bridge didn't affect water flow in any way." "That's not true, and you know it," I replied. "If you're concerned about the creek, you should have attended the watershed meeting last month instead of trying to bully me." Linda's expression hardened. "I don't have time for this. We're removing the bridge." She turned to the workers who had gathered nearby. "Proceed as planned." To my shock, the men actually started moving toward my backyard, the excavator operator firing up his machine. "Stop right there!" I called out, pulling out my phone. "This is private property. You're trespassing, and I'm calling the sheriff." Linda laughed. "Go ahead. The county is well aware of our action today. In fact, they approved it." Something in her tone made me pause. Did she actually have county approval? Had she somehow convinced officials that my property was part of Pinewood Estates? I hadn't registered my deed with the county when I inherited the property from my father. Could there be some legal loophole she was exploiting? The doubt must have shown on my face because Linda's smile widened. She gestured again to the workers, who continued their advance toward my backyard. The excavator rumbled forward, its metal tracks leaving marks on my lawn. I felt a moment of panic. If I physically tried to stop them, things could get ugly fast. If I didn't, my bridge would be destroyed before any authorities could arrive. I needed to buy time. "Wait," I said, stepping forward. "At least show me the county approval. I have a right to see the document before you destroy my property." Linda hesitated, then thrust the paper toward me. I took it, my eyes scanning the text quickly. It was a general permit for waterway maintenance in Pinewood Estates. Nothing specifically about my property or my bridge. More importantly, it was dated over 6 months ago and signed by a county official who had since retired. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This doesn't authorize you to touch my bridge," I said, handing the paper back. "This is a general maintenance permit for Pinewood Estates waterways. My property isn't part of your development." "That's your interpretation," Linda snapped, taking the document back. "Ours differs." She turned to the workers again. "Continue." I had no choice. I dialed 911, explaining that trespassers with heavy machinery were attempting to destroy my property. The dispatcher promised to send someone immediately, but I knew it would take at least 10 minutes for anyone to arrive. In those 10 minutes, Linda directed the workers to position themselves around my bridge. The excavator moved into place, its bucket hovering dangerously close to the wooden structure I had built with such care. The other workers began unloading tools, saws, crowbars, sledgehammers. I stood at the edge of my yard, phone in hand, recording everything. Linda noticed and scoffed. "Recording won't help you, Mr. Wilson. You're the one in violation here." My neighbor James Bailey had noticed the commotion and came over from his property, which bordered mine. James was one of the few neighbors who had always been friendly, despite Linda's obvious disapproval of our relationship. "What's going on, Mark?" he asked, eyeing the machinery with concern. "Linda thinks she can tear down my bridge because her HOA doesn't like it," I explained, "despite the fact that my property isn't even part of Pinewood Estates." James frowned. "That can't be legal." "It's not," I confirmed. "I'm waiting for the sheriff to arrive." James crossed his arms. "Well, I'm staying right here with you until they do." Linda glared at James. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Bailey." "Actually, it does," James replied calmly. "Mark's bridge doesn't bother anyone, and I know for a fact his property isn't part of the HOA because mine isn't either. We're both on the original Wilson land that predates your development." Linda's composure slipped just slightly. She hadn't expected resistance from multiple grunts, but she recovered quickly. "The waterway affects all residents. We have authority to maintain it." "That's not how waterways work," James said, shaking his head. "You can't just claim jurisdiction over someone else's land because water flows through it." The excavator operator, who had been listening to this exchange, turned to Linda with a hesitant expression. "Ma'am, if there's a dispute about property lines, maybe we should wait." "There is no dispute," Linda snapped. "Proceed as directed." I could see the operator's discomfort, but after a moment's hesitation, he turned back to the controls. The excavator's arm extended, the bucket moving toward one of the bridge supports, just as the metal bucket was about to make contact with my bridge. The welcome sound of sirens cut through the air. A sheriff's department SUV pulled up in front of my house, followed closely by a county vehicle. Linda's expression flickered between annoyance and confidence. She clearly believed the county was on her side. The excavator operator immediately shut down his machine, looking relieved at the interruption. Sheriff's Deputy Miller stepped out of his vehicle, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. Behind him, a man in a county inspector's uniform emerged from the second vehicle. "What's going on here?" Deputy Miller asked, approaching our group. Linda stepped forward immediately. "We're conducting authorized maintenance on a waterway that affects the Pinewood Estates community. This man is interfering with our work." I shook my head. "Deputy, these people are trespassing on my private property and attempting to destroy my bridge without any legal right to do so." Deputy Miller looked between us. "Do you have documentation, ma'am? Proof that you have authority to be on this property?" Linda held up her permit with a triumphant smile. "Right here, county-approved waterway maintenance." The county inspector stepped forward, taking the document from Linda. He studied it for a moment, then frowned. "This is a general maintenance permit for Pinewood Estates common areas. It doesn't grant access to private property outside the development." Linda's smile faltered. "This property is part of Pinewood Estates. All properties in this area are covered by our HOA covenants." "Actually," I interjected, "I have my deed and property survey right here." I pulled the documents from the HOA folder I'd prepared. "My property has never been part of Pinewood Estates. It's been in my family since 1962, long before the development existed." The inspector examined my paperwork carefully, then nodded. "These appear to be in order. According to these documents, this property is indeed separate from the Pinewood Estates development." Linda's face flushed red. "That's impossible. All properties in this area are part of our jurisdiction." "Not according to the county records," the inspector replied firmly. "This property and the one next door," he nodded toward James, "were never incorporated into the development. They remain separate parcels." Deputy Miller turned to Linda. "Ma'am, without clear authorization, you and your contractors are trespassing on private property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately." Linda stood frozen, her carefully maintained composure cracking visibly. "This is outrageous. We have the right to maintain community standards." "Not on property that isn't part of your community," Deputy Miller stated flatly. "Now please remove your equipment and leave, or I'll have to take further action." The workers were already packing up, clearly wanting no part of this confrontation. The excavator operator had shut down his machine completely and was preparing to load it back on the trailer. Linda looked around, realizing her support was evaporating. Tom and Diane, who had been watching from Linda's SUV, wouldn't even meet her gaze. The contractors were rapidly distancing themselves from the situation. "This isn't over," she hissed at me before turning on her heel and storming back to her vehicle. I watched as the small convoy that had arrived with such confidence now departed. In disarray, the excavator was quickly loaded onto its trailer. The workers piled into their truck, and Linda's SUV led them away, tires squealing slightly as she accelerated down the street. "Thank you, Deputy," I said, extending my hand. "And you too," I added to the county inspector. The inspector handed my documents back to me. "You might want to register these properly with the county if you haven't already. It could prevent future misunderstandings." I nodded. "I'll do that first thing tomorrow." As they prepared to leave, Deputy Miller paused. "Has this been an ongoing issue?" "Unfortunately, yes," I admitted. "The HOA has been trying to enforce their rules on my property for years, despite the fact that I've never been a member." He frowned. "If there's further trouble, don't hesitate to call. Attempting to destroy someone's property is a serious matter." After they left, James clapped me on the shoulder. "That was something else. Linda's had it coming for a long time." I sighed, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally wearing off. "I just want to be left alone to enjoy my property in peace." After today, I think she might finally get the message. James said, but knowing Linda, I wouldn't count on it. He was right not to be optimistic. This was just the beginning of Linda's campaign against my bridge and against me. But what she didn't realize was that in trying to tear down my small wooden bridge, she had started a chain of events that would eventually dismantle the very power structure she had built for herself in Pinewood Estates. And I would be there to watch it fall, one board at a time. The days following Linda's failed attempt to tear down my bridge were surprisingly quiet. Too quiet. Anyone who knew Linda Pearson knew she wasn't one to accept defeat gracefully. I spent those days fortifying my defenses. I filed my property deed and survey with the county clerk's office, installed security cameras around my property, and consulted with a property attorney about my rights. "This is crystal clear," Sarah Mitchell said, reviewing my documents in her downtown office. "Your property is completely separate from Pinewood Estates. They have absolutely no jurisdiction over your land." She tapped a manicured nail against the survey map. "What concerns me is how aggressive this HOA president has been. These tactics border on harassment." I nodded, thinking of Linda's smug face as she had directed those excavators onto my property. What should I expect next? Sarah leaned back in her chair. "Based on my experience with overzealous HOAs, she'll likely try a different angle. Maybe code violations with the county, complaints about noise or eyesores, possibly even legal action. Claiming your bridge somehow impacts the community." Her prediction proved eerily accurate. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. It claimed my bridge created a nuisance and hazard by encouraging trespassing into the community and potentially affecting downstream water quality. They demanded its removal within 15 days or threatened legal action. I forwarded the letter to Sarah, who responded with a terse email. "They're bluffing, I'll handle this." Her formal response to their firm was a masterpiece of legal smackdown, pointing out that not only did they lack jurisdiction, but any further attempts to interfere with my property would constitute harassment and potentially criminal trespassing. That should have been the end of it. But Linda was nothing if not persistent. The next salvo came in the form of a county inspection team that showed up unannounced one afternoon. They apologetically explained they were responding to multiple complaints about unsafe structures and watershed violations. I showed them my bridge, my permits, and my property documents. They quickly determined everything was in order and left, clearly embarrassed about the wasted visit. What I didn't expect was what happened next. The county inspector pulled me aside before leaving. "Look, I shouldn't be telling you this," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "But you should know there's something fishy going on with Pinewood Estates. This isn't the first complaint we've investigated that turned out to be baseless." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "Let's just say certain members of that HOA board seem to have unusual influence with some county officials. They've managed to push through inspections, fast-track permits, and even influence zoning decisions in ways that don't always follow standard procedures." That night, I couldn't sleep. The inspector's words kept replaying in my mind. Unusual, influence. What exactly did that mean? And then it hit me, a memory from last year's local news, a small scandal about county contracts being awarded without proper bidding processes. One of the companies mentioned had been owned by Tom Richards, the HOA vice president. The next morning, I called James. "I need your help with something," I told him. "Do you remember anything about county contracts and Tom Richards?" James was silent for a moment. "Actually, yes. My brother-in-law works in the county records office. He mentioned something about irregularities with park maintenance contracts. Why?" "I think there might be connections between the HOA board and county officials that go beyond normal community relations," I explained. "And I think that might be why Linda has been so confident about pushing her authority beyond Pinewood Estates. James was quiet for a moment. My brother-in-law might be able to help us look into this, discreetly, of course. What we discovered over the next week was both shocking and illuminating. Tom Richards' company had indeed received multiple county contracts under suspicious circumstances. Diane Cooper's husband worked in the county permitting office, and Linda herself had a brother-in-law who was a senior administrator in the county executive's office. But the real bombshell came when James's brother-in-law sent us copies of the original Pinewood Estates development plans. According to those documents, the HOA's jurisdiction was significantly smaller than what Linda had been claiming. In fact, nearly a dozen properties on the periphery of the neighborhood, including several whose owners had been paying HOA dues for years, were never actually part of Pinewood Estates at all. Linda hadn't just been overstepping with me. She had been systematically expanding the HOA's territory, collecting dues from properties that weren't legally under their jurisdiction, and using her connections to prevent any challenges to her authority. It was a stunning revelation. What had started as a simple dispute over my bridge had uncovered what appeared to be years of deliberate misrepresentation and possible fraud. The question now was, what should I do with this information? I decided to take action. Armed with all the evidence we had gathered, I contacted Sarah Mitchell again. Her eyes widened as she reviewed the documents James and I had collected. "This goes way beyond a property dispute," she said, shaking her head. "This is potentially criminal. Multiple homeowners paying dues to an HOA they're not legally part of, county contracts awarded through suspicious channels. This needs to go to the district attorney's office." But before we took that step, I had another idea. "I want to give these homeowners a chance to know the truth first," I told her. "They deserve to know they've been paying dues they never owed." Sarah agreed to help draft a carefully worded letter outlining our findings. We sent copies to every homeowner in the disputed boundary areas, including copies of the original development plans showing the true borders of Pinewood Estates. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone started ringing within hours of the letters being delivered. Neighbors I barely knew showed up at my door, property documents in hand, faces reflecting shock and anger as they realized they'd been paying unnecessary HOA fees for years. Some had even made expensive modifications to their homes to comply with HOA regulations they were never subject to. By the next evening, an impromptu meeting had formed in my backyard. More than 20 homeowners gathered around my controversial bridge, which had now become a symbol of resistance. James brought coolers of drinks, someone else ordered pizzas, and my small wooden bridge suddenly became the center of a community uprising. I paid them $8,000 to replace my roof because they said my shingles weren't the right shade, exclaimed Eleanor, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down from me. "And you're telling me I was never even part of their HOA? They fined me $500 when my son left his basketball hoop up overnight," added Michael, a single dad from the cul-de-sac. "I had to work overtime for weeks to pay it." Story after story poured out, each more infuriating than the last. Years of petty tyranny, unnecessary expenses, and constant stress, all imposed on people who had never legally been subject to the HOA's authority. "We need to take this to the authorities," Robert, a retired accountant, insisted. "This is fraud, plain and simple. And we need to demand our money back," added Sophia, a young mother whose garden had been forcibly removed because it didn't meet HOA standards. The meeting lasted well into the night. By the time everyone left, we had formed a committee, started a group chat, and scheduled a formal meeting with Sarah Mitchell to discuss our legal options. The tide was turning, and Linda's empire was beginning to crumble. We didn't have to wait long for her response. The very next morning, as I was leaving for work, I found Linda standing in my driveway. Gone was the confident, smirking HOA president. She looked pale, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of haste. "We need to talk," she said, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. I crossed my arms. "I think we're past that point." "Linda, you don't understand what you're doing," she insisted. "The community needs structure, rules. Without the HOA, everything will fall apart." I couldn't help but laugh. The community was here long before your HOA, Linda, and the actual legal members of Pinewood Estates can keep their HOA. This isn't about destroying the organization. It's about ending your overreach. Her expression hardened. "I've worked too hard to build this community. I won't let you destroy it over a silly bridge." "This stopped being about my bridge the moment I discovered you've been collecting dues from properties that aren't part of your HOA," I replied. "Did you really think nobody would ever check? That you could just keep expanding your territory and nobody would notice?" For the first time, I saw something like fear in Linda's eyes. "What do you want?" she asked bluntly. "Justice," I answered simply. "Restitution for everyone who's paid fees they didn't owe. Your resignation from the board. And a legally binding agreement that you and the HOA will never again try to exercise authority over properties outside your jurisdiction." Linda's face flushed with anger. "That's ridiculous. I'll fight this every step of the way." I shrugged. "That's your choice. But we've already scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office. The paper trail is clear, Linda. How do you think the rest of the actual HOA members will react when they learn their board has been misappropriating funds and lying about the community's borders?" She didn't have an answer for that. Without another word, she turned and stormed back to her SUV, tires squealing as she drove away. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Our group met with the district attorney, who opened an investigation into the HOA board's practices. We filed a class action lawsuit seeking restitution of all improperly collected fees, and perhaps most satisfyingly, the legitimate members of Pinewood Estates called for an emergency meeting to address the revelations. I didn't attend that meeting. I wasn't a member after all, but James's cousin lived within the actual HOA boundaries and gave us a full report. The meeting had been chaotic, with Linda trying desperately to maintain control as angry homeowners demanded explanations. When she couldn't provide satisfactory answers, the members voted overwhelmingly to remove the entire board and hold emergency elections. By the end of the month, Linda Pearson was no longer the HOA president. Tom Richards resigned from the board and closed his company as county officials began reviewing all his contracts. Diane Cooper moved away suddenly, her house sold at a suspiciously low price. The final victory came in the form of a legal settlement. Rather than risk criminal charges, Linda and the former board members agreed to repay all improperly collected fees with interest, cover all legal expenses, and sign legally binding agreements never to serve on any HOA board again. As for my bridge, it still stands exactly as I built it, connecting my yard to my wooded lot across the creek. Sometimes I sit on it in the evenings, watching the water flow beneath the wooden planks, marveling at how this simple structure became the catalyst for exposing years of corruption and abuse of power. The most unexpected outcome, though, has been the community that formed through this ordeal. What began as a disparate group of frustrated homeowners has become a tight-knit neighborhood of friends. We hold regular cookouts now, rotating between our various yards, none of which are subject to HOA regulations about appropriate gathering sizes or approved grill models. Last weekend, we held the first annual Bridge Day celebration. Nearly 40 neighbors gathered in my backyard, sharing food and stories. Children played on and around the bridge that Linda had been so determined to tear down. Eleanor brought her famous apple pie. Michael and his son organized games, Even some residents from within the actual Pinewood Estates boundaries came, including the newly elected HOA president, a reasonable woman who understands the true limits of her authority. As the sun set and children chased fireflies around my yard, James raised his glass in a toast. "To Mark's Bridge," he called out, "the little bridge that stood up to a tyrant and brought us all together." Everyone cheered, and I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. Linda had wanted to tear down my bridge because it didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should be. Instead, her actions had built something far more valuable than any physical structure, a community based on mutual respect, genuine connection, and the simple understanding that sometimes the most important boundaries are the ones that keep power in check. And as for Linda Pearson, I heard she moved to a high-rise condo downtown. No yard, no bridge, and most importantly, no HOA. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.